Nathan Carter had seen his fair share of battles, but he never expected his toughest fight to be over something as simple as a barn. After years of service in the military, he finally settled into a peaceful life on his dream property, a beautiful stretch of land just outside a quiet suburban neighborhood. His barn, a sturdy, well-maintained structure, was more than just a building. It was where he worked on his projects, stored equipment, and found solace in the simplicity of hard work. But peace wasn't something Karen Thompson, the HOA president, was willing to let him have. Karen ruled the Homeowners Association with an iron fist and a clipboard, treating every minor infraction as a personal attack. She was the type who measured grass length with a ruler and took pictures of porch decorations that didn't match the aesthetic guidelines. And now, she had set her sights on Nathan's barn, calling it an unapproved structure that violated the HOA's strict policies, even though his property wasn't even in the HOA's jurisdiction. Nathan had moved just outside the HOA's boundaries intentionally, avoiding the power-hungry nonsense that came with it. His home was technically exempt from their rules, but that didn't stop Karen from trying to force her authority on him. She had already sent multiple letters in the mail, all marked with bold red warnings about non-compliance and urgent corrective action. At first, Nathan ignored them. But then the notices escalated. Fines, threats of legal action, and warnings about property liens started showing up. That's when he knew this wasn't going away. One afternoon, as Nathan was hauling a few planks into the barn for some repairs, he heard the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice, sharp, condescending, and laced with smug authority. "Nathan, I've told you before, that barn has to go." He turned slowly, setting down the wood. Karen stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, a clipboard clutched like it was some kind of legal weapon. Behind her, 2 other board members lurked, nodding in agreement like well-trained minions. Nathan sighed. "Karen, my property isn't in the HOA. You don't get to make rules for me." Karen scoffed. "Oh, but I do. Your property borders the HOA, and as such, it falls under the aesthetic and environmental guidelines of our community. That barn is an eyesore, and we won't tolerate it." Nathan clenched his jaw. "That barn has been here longer than half the houses in this neighborhood. It's not going anywhere." Karen's smile was tight, her eyes gleaming with misplaced confidence. "Then I suppose you won't mind the fine I just issued. $1,500 for an unauthorized structure. And if it's not removed in 30 days, we'll escalate." Nathan took the paper she shoved toward him, barely glancing at it before tearing it in half. "You can't fine me, Karen. I don't answer to you." Her face twitched, just for a second, before she recovered with an even bigger smirk. "We'll see about that." As she turned to leave, Nathan had a sinking feeling this was only the beginning. HOA's first power move. Nathan Carter wasn't one to back down from a fight, especially not one as ridiculous as this. He had faced enemies on battlefields. Dealing with an overzealous HOA president should have been easy. But Karen was persistent. The very next morning, he found another envelope taped to his door, this time thicker than the last. Nathan tore it open and skimmed through the contents. Violation notice. Failure to comply with HOA standards. Fine, $3,000. Deadline for removal, 14 days. Nathan let out a dry chuckle. So she doubled down. He folded the paper and tossed it onto his workbench before heading outside. Across the street, Karen was standing in her driveway, watching with the same smug satisfaction she always had. "You're really trying this, huh?" Nathan called out, holding up the fine. Karen feigned innocence, clasping her hands together. "It's nothing personal, Nathan. The HOA has rules. You chose to move here, so you chose to follow them." Nathan took a few steps toward her, keeping his voice calm. "Karen, I don't live in the HOA. You have no authority here. You're harassing me." Karen's expression didn't change. "You can dispute the fines if you like, but I assure you, our legal team is prepared. You should just pay up and comply. It'll save you a lot of trouble." Nathan exhaled slowly, restraining the urge to laugh. "Your legal team?" "Karen, I've read the HOA charter. Your board can't enforce penalties outside of HOA properties." Karen's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "You might want to check again." Before Nathan could respond, a white city inspector's truck pulled up in front of his property. A man in a neatly pressed shirt stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Carter?" Nathan folded his arms. "That's me." The inspector nodded, glancing at his clipboard. "We received a complaint about an unauthorized structure on your property. We need to conduct an inspection." Nathan's jaw clenched. "Of course." Karen called in the city. You got a warrant? The inspector hesitated. Well, no, but if you don't allow us to inspect the property, the complaint will escalate. Nathan stepped forward. No warrant, no inspection. Come back with one. The inspector shifted uncomfortably. We're just doing our job, sir. And I'm just protecting my property. Karen, still standing nearby, let out a dramatic sigh. Nathan, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Nathan turned to her, his patience wearing thin. No, Karen. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Karen narrowed her eyes but said nothing. The inspector eventually relented, scribbling something on his clipboard. I'll note that you refused inspection. Expect follow-ups. With that, he got back into his truck and drove off. Nathan watched him leave before turning back to Karen. You can call whoever you want, Karen. I'm not budging. Karen didn't respond. Instead, she just gave him a knowing smirk before heading back to her house. Nathan clenched his fists. This was far from over. The HOA escalates the conflict. Nathan Carter knew the battle wasn't over, but he hadn't expected Karen to escalate things so quickly. 2 days after the failed inspection, he woke up to the sound of a tow truck idling in his driveway. He threw on a shirt and boots before stepping outside. A uniformed tow truck driver was already hooking up his truck, his own truck, to the tow cable. Nathan's stomach twisted in irritation. What the hell do you think you're doing? Nathan barked. The driver, a lanky man with a worn-out cap, glanced up. Got an order from the HOA. Says this vehicle is in violation of community guidelines. Nathan ran a hand down his face. It's not in the HOA. The driver hesitated. Look, buddy, I just go where they tell me. Nathan turned and spotted Karen standing smugly across the street, her clipboard in hand as always. She called out, Non-operational vehicles aren't allowed on visible property, Nathan. We sent multiple notices. Nathan exhaled sharply, stalking toward her. It's not non-operational. It's my daily driver. Karen's smirk deepened. Well, it doesn't look like it runs. Nathan took another step forward, lowering his voice. If you don't tell him to unhook my truck right now, Karen, I'll make damn sure the HOA regrets this. Karen's confidence wavered for a split second before she scoffed. We're within our rights. Nathan pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the tow truck, the driver, and Karen in the background. I hope you have a lawyer, Karen, because this is theft. The driver must have sensed the tension because he suddenly raised his hands. Hey, I don't want any trouble. If there's an issue, I'll take it up with the HOA. He climbed into his cab and unhooked Nathan's truck before driving off. Karen's expression darkened. You're only making this harder for yourself. Nathan shook his head. No, Karen, you are. She huffed, turning on her heel and marching back to her house. But Nathan wasn't just going to let this go. That evening, Nathan sat in his office, poring over the HOA's financials. He had managed to get a look at the documents through a concerned board member, one who was getting fed up with Karen's antics. The numbers didn't add up. Large sums of money were being funneled into vague community improvement projects. But there were no records of any such projects ever being completed. Nathan's gut told him exactly what was happening. Karen was pocketing the money. And now he had the proof. It was time to turn the tables. The next morning, he made his way to the city offices, files in hand. The clerk at the front desk barely glanced up before saying, Can I help you? Nathan placed the documents on the counter. Yeah, I'd like to report fraudulent HOA activity. The clerk straightened up, suddenly interested. What kind of fraud? Nathan smirked. Let's just say, someone's been stealing from the neighborhood. It was only a matter of time before the walls started closing in on Karen. The HOA oversteps and the protagonist strikes back. Nathan Carter knew Karen wasn't going to back down without a fight. He had uncovered the financial fraud buried within the HOA's records, but he needed to be strategic. If he acted too soon, she'd cover her tracks. If he waited too long, she might pull something even worse. And she did. 2 days later, Nathan woke up to a sudden loss of power in his house. He checked the breaker. Nothing was tripped. But a glance out his window showed the real problem. A city utility truck sat at the edge of his property, a worker packing up his gear. Nathan grabbed his boots and rushed outside. Hey, what's going on here? He called out. The worker turned, looking apologetic. HOA submitted a request to disconnect utilities for non-payment. Nathan frowned. That's impossible. I own this house outright. I don't have an HOA. The worker scratched the back of his head. Look, man, I'm just following the work order. Nathan's jaw tightened. This wasn't a mistake. This was Karen. He marched straight to her house and pounded on the door. Karen opened it, looking amused. "Nathan, I really don't appreciate unannounced visits." Nathan held up his phone. "I just got off the line with the city utilities office. You had my power cut off under false pretenses." Karen feigned innocence. "Oh dear, that sounds like a clerical error." Nathan stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Listen to me, and listen carefully. You're done. I have proof of your fraudulent financial records. I know about the fines you've been issuing off the books. And I know you're illegally enforcing rules outside HOA jurisdiction." Karen's confident smirk faltered for a split second. "I don't know what you're talking about." Nathan pulled out a folder from under his arm. "Then I guess you won't mind me handing these over to the city. And maybe a few news outlets while I'm at it." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. "You wouldn't." Nathan leaned in. "Try me." She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, a neighbor's voice cut through the air. "Nathan." He turned to see several residents gathering on the sidewalk, watching the confrontation unfold. Some of them held copies of HOA fine notices in their hands. One man stepped forward, shaking his head. "Did she really cut off your power?" Nathan nodded. "Not just mine. I bet if some of you check, you'll find out your late fees have been lining someone's pockets." The crowd murmured in agreement. More neighbors stepped out of their houses, and suddenly, Karen looked trapped. "You've been running a scam, Karen," another neighbor called out. "Where's all our money going?" Karen turned back to Nathan, her eyes flashing with anger. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over? You're nobody." Nathan smiled. "No, Karen. I'm the guy who just ended your reign of terror." An hour later, the city inspector arrived, this time with actual legal backing. Nathan watched as they combed through the HOA office records. It didn't take long before the first words of fraud and embezzlement started floating around. Karen's face was pale as one of the inspectors turned to her. "Ms. Thompson, we'll need you to come down to the office for questioning." She started to protest, but the weight of the gathered crowd and the overwhelming evidence made her shut her mouth. Nathan crossed his arms as she was led away. For the first time since this nonsense began, he felt like justice was being served. Karen's final, desperate move. Nathan Carter had won the battle, but he knew the war wasn't over just yet. Karen was like a cornered animal, desperate, dangerous, and willing to do anything to save herself. The day after the city inspectors seized HOA records, Nathan received an unexpected knock on his door. It was two police officers. "Mr. Carter?" one of them asked, holding a notepad. Nathan sighed. "Here we go. That's me. We received a complaint about unauthorized construction and zoning violations on your property." Nathan folded his arms. "Let me guess. Karen Thompson filed it?" The officer hesitated before nodding. "We're just here to follow up." Nathan shook his head. "Karen's been harassing me for weeks. I already filed a complaint with the city about her. If you check the HOA records, you'll find evidence of fraud." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before nodding. "We're aware of the investigation. We just needed to confirm that you haven't made any unauthorized changes." Nathan gestured around. "Does anything look different to you?" The officer sighed. "No, sir. Just doing our job." Karen had just played her last card, and it was pathetic. As the officers left, Nathan spotted Karen lurking behind her curtains. He smirked and gave her a friendly wave. She yanked the blinds shut. That evening, Nathan decided to check his security cameras. Sure enough, the footage from the night before showed Karen sneaking onto his property, clipboard in hand. She had been taking pictures, probably trying to fabricate more violations. Nathan chuckled to himself. Amateur. He compiled the footage and sent it to both the HOA board and the city officials handling her investigation. Then, for good measure, he sent it to the entire neighborhood group chat. Within minutes, his phone exploded with messages. "Speech balloon, she's lost her mind." "Speech balloon, this is illegal." "Speech balloon, is she spying on all of us?" The neighborhood was officially turning against Karen. The next morning, Karen's house was the center of attention. A group of furious homeowners had gathered outside, demanding answers. Nathan didn't even have to get involved. By the time he stepped onto his porch, he saw Karen arguing with two HOA board members. "This is ridiculous," Karen snapped. "You're taking his side?" One of the board members shook his head. "Karen, we saw the footage. You broke into his property. That's not enforcement, that's trespassing." Another resident stepped forward. "You fined my kids for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. You towed my husband's truck for no reason." And now we find out you've been stealing from us. Karen's face turned red. I was doing what's best for the community. A woman scoffed. No, you were doing what was best for you. Just then, a city official stepped through the crowd. Ms. Thompson, we need to have a word with you about the financial discrepancies in the HOA accounts. Karen's face went pale. Nathan crossed his arms. Guess you finally ran out of power, Karen. Karen spun to face him, her eyes full of fury. You think you've won? Nathan smiled. No, Karen. I know I have. As Karen was led away, the neighborhood erupted into whispers. Nathan turned back to his barn, the same one that had started this whole mess, and smiled. It was still standing. And Karen? She was officially finished. HOA crumbles and Karen's downfall. Nathan Carter had fought plenty of battles in his life, but watching Karen's empire collapse was the most satisfying one yet. The fallout from her exposure was immediate. The HOA board, desperate to distance itself from Karen's corruption, called for an emergency meeting. Normally, these meetings were quiet affairs where Karen steamrolled over any opposition. Not this time. Nathan arrived early, taking a seat near the back. The clubhouse was packed, filled with angry homeowners, city officials, and even a couple of local reporters who had caught wind of the scandal. At the front, the HOA board members looked visibly nervous. They weren't used to this level of scrutiny. Karen, however, was nowhere to be seen. The board president, a man named Alan Parker, cleared his throat. We'd like to begin by addressing the recent allegations regarding our former president, Ms. Thompson. A murmur ran through the crowd. Former? Alan continued. Given the overwhelming evidence of financial misconduct, we have voted to remove Ms. Thompson from her position, effective immediately. The crowd erupted in applause. Nathan smirked. And just like that, Karen was out. But Alan wasn't done. Additionally, the city has opened an official investigation into the HOA's financial practices. All fines issued under Ms. Thompson's leadership are now under review. If you have been improperly charged, you may be eligible for reimbursement. A man in the front row scoffed. You mean we might get our money back? Alan held up his hands. We're working with the city to ensure fairness. But yes, many of these fines will be refunded. Nathan leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He had expected Karen to lose her position, but getting people's money back? That was a cherry on top. Then came the best part. Finally, Alan said, flipping through his notes. Given the extent of the corruption uncovered, we will be holding a vote to determine whether this HOA should be dissolved entirely. The room fell silent. Then one voice shouted, Yes. More voices joined in. Shut it down. We don't need the HOA. Dissolve it. Alan held up his hands again. The vote will be conducted officially, but we hear you loud and clear. Nathan didn't even need to cast his ballot to know how it would end. Karen's empire wasn't just crumbling, it was about to be wiped off the map. That evening, Nathan sat on his porch, sipping a well-earned drink. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over his barn. The same barn Karen had tried so hard to get rid of. His phone buzzed. A text from one of the neighbors. Speech balloon, she's putting her house up for sale. Nathan chuckled. He wasn't surprised. With the HOA gone, Karen had lost all her power. And without her steady stream of stolen fines, she was probably struggling to pay her mortgage. He glanced across the street, and sure enough, there was a brand new for sale sign in Karen's yard. Poetic justice. As Nathan leaned back, he spotted another text in the neighborhood group chat. Speech balloon, we should throw a Karen's gone party. The replies poured in. Speech balloon, I'll bring the drinks. Speech balloon, someone print out the fake violations she gave us. We'll burn them. Speech balloon, good riddance. Nathan laughed. The nightmare was finally over. And Karen? She was done. The HOA faces full legal consequences. Nathan Carter thought Karen's downfall was satisfying enough, but what came next was even better. A week after Karen's removal, the city officially announced a full-scale audit of the HOA's financial records. It didn't take long for investigators to confirm what Nathan had already suspected. Tens of thousands of dollars in misappropriated funds. Karen hadn't just been issuing fake fines. She had been skimming off every HOA transaction for years. And now, she was finally going to pay the price. At the next HOA meeting, likely one of the last before the HOA's dissolution, the atmosphere was electric. Alan Parker, the interim HOA president, stood at the front, his hands gripping the podium. I won't sugarcoat this, he said, scanning the crowd. The investigation has revealed a significant amount of missing money. As a result, The city has officially issued a fine of $250,000 against the HOA. The room erupted into gasps and whispers. Nathan smirked. That's gonna sting. Alan cleared his throat. This amount will be pursued legally against the responsible parties. Specifically, he paused for effect, Karen Thompson and select board members who knowingly participated. Nathan wasn't the only one who grinned. A few neighbors even cheered. A woman in the front row shook her head. So what happens now? Alan let out a breath. That depends on our vote. If the HOA dissolves, all financial obligations will fall on Karen and those involved. If it remains intact, residents may share the burden of paying the fine. Someone in the back immediately shouted, "Dissolve it." The whole room echoed in agreement. Alan gave a small nod. The official vote will take place at the end of this meeting, but I think I already know the outcome. Nathan leaned back in his chair. Good. Karen wasn't just out of power. She was now buried under legal trouble. And Nathan? He had won. By the time the meeting ended, the vote was unanimous. The HOA was officially dissolved. Nathan walked outside, stretching as the evening air cooled. Around him, neighbors laughed and chatted, celebrating their newfound freedom from Karen's tyranny. His phone buzzed again. A message from a local news reporter. Speech balloon Mr. Carter. Would you be open to an interview about the HOA's corruption case? Nathan chuckled. He wasn't interested in fame, but the thought of Karen seeing her humiliation broadcasted for the whole town? That was too good to pass up. Karen's personal downfall. With the HOA dissolved and the lawsuits piling up, Karen Thompson had officially lost everything. Nathan Carter hadn't seen much of her since the vote, but word traveled fast in the neighborhood. She had tried everything to fight back, appealing the city fines, calling in favors, even threatening to sue the remaining board members. But no one was on her side anymore. Karen had gone from queen of the HOA to a pariah. And the best part, she was broke. One afternoon, Nathan was out fixing his fence when he spotted a moving truck in Karen's driveway. A for sale sign had been up for weeks, but now it was official. She was leaving. Nathan watched as Karen stormed out of her house, barking orders at the movers. She looked miserable, hair disheveled, stress lines deeper than ever. He leaned on his fence, giving her a polite nod. Moving day? Karen whipped around, her eyes burning with resentment. Enjoying yourself? Nathan shrugged. A little. She scoffed, folding her arms. You ruined everything, you know. Nathan raised an eyebrow. I ruined everything? Karen, you brought this on yourself. You scammed your neighbors, abused your power, and thought you'd never get caught. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I was protecting this neighborhood. Nathan chuckled. No, you were protecting your wallet. Karen's fists clenched, but she had no comeback. She had lost. And she knew it. As Karen walked away, Nathan called after her. Oh, by the way, heard you got a new job? Karen froze. Slowly, she turned back. How do you know that? Nathan grinned. Small town. People talk. A neighbor jogging by overheard and laughed out loud. Oh yeah, tell him, Karen. Karen glared daggers at them, but said nothing. Nathan crossed his arms. So, you're working for another HOA, huh? Karen's face turned red. Because it was true. After everything, after destroying her reputation, losing her home, and getting buried in lawsuits, Karen had only been able to find one job. As a low-level administrator at another HOA. Nathan shook his head, trying not to laugh. Guess old habits die hard. Karen stormed back toward her car, slamming the door shut. Nathan watched as she peeled out of the neighborhood for the last time. He took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. Karen Thompson, the most hated woman in the HOA, was finally gone. Epilogue and final mic drop with Karen gone. The neighborhood felt brand new. People were finally relaxing. Kids played outside without fear of getting fined for sidewalk chalk vandalism. Neighbors helped each other instead of spying for HOA violations, and, most importantly, Nathan Carter's barn still stood untouched. One evening, as he sat on his porch, sipping a cold drink, a neighbor walked up with a piece of paper. Hey, Nathan, they said, handing it to him with a grin. Nathan raised an eyebrow and unfolded it. It was a fake HOA violation notice. Infraction, being too awesome. Fine. 1 case of beer, payable to your grateful neighbors. Nathan burst out laughing. Real cute. The neighbor chuckled. Had to keep the tradition alive somehow. Nathan smirked. Well, at least this one's fair. He stood up, stretching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. exactly what it was meant to be before Karen tried turning it into her personal kingdom. Nathan took one last look at his barn, his house, and the community he had fought for. Then, with a satisfied grin, he tore up the fake fine, clapped his neighbor on the back, and walked inside. The reign of HOA Karen was over.